Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Halion 7 tutorial series. Going to have a look at low frequency oscillators today, or LFOs. We've already seen them a couple of times in this series previously, and I keep saying we've not dealt with this yet, but, well, today we're going to deal with them. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's a really fantastic way to do it, and a huge thanks to everybody who's signed up so far. It really means a lot to me. Okay, so here we have our single sawtooth oscillator, as simple as it gets. I'm going to lock two sections in place today. I want the filter section open, and I'm also going to go to the LFO section and lock that open. So a low frequency oscillator is not designed to produce sound. It's theoretically capable, anything over 20 odd hertz you're going to be able to hear, but fundamentally it's designed to be a modulator of something else somewhere in the system. It's designed to be a modulation source. And they're such a common means of producing modulation that they have their own section. They're usually dealt with completely independently, and that's what we've got here. We've got two separate LFOs to play with, LFO 1 and 2. They are identical in every conceivable respect, basically just different sources that you can send to different locations. There's also a third low frequency oscillator called the XLFO, the cross LFO. Now I've already made a pretty substantial video on XLFO alone. I did consider whether or not to re-record it, but I watched it back today and it's about as good as I can do. So I'm going to put a link to that above if you want to watch that episode. But today we're going to deal with the standard LFOs and how they patch into Halion. And for the first demonstration, I'm going to use a fairly new feature to Halion, which is the drag and drop functionality. Wherever you have a draggable modulation source, it's going to be indicated by this little four-way icon. I pick that up. As soon as I start moving it, everything's going to turn green. And now wherever I drop this source, that's going to be the destination to which the LFO is going to be attached. Now I've currently got LFO 1 selected, so this is going to target LFO 1 into the cutoff. Let's drop it. Now because we've got both of these sections open, you've seen each of their respective modulation rows appear. So each of these entries that I'm toggling backwards and forwards, they're the same view. If I move one, you'll see the other change. And this control that I'm adjusting here is the modulation depth. This is the amount by which this thing is going to affect this thing. The source is going to affect the destination. Those are the terms that you use when describing modulation. As we've previously seen, modulation destinations that have a source attached have this little orange dot indicating their current value. When I press a note, this is going to start oscillating backwards and forwards. Now, can you see that it's kind of going up to the line and then only forwards? That's because at the moment, this low frequency oscillator is unipolar. In other words, it only travels in one direction. Curiously, this setting is not a feature of the low frequency oscillator itself. It's more to do with the connection, basically what it's attaching to. So you don't affect the polarity from inside the LFO section. You control it from the mapping between the source and the destination. It's got its own little icon. Here we go, polarity, unipolar or bipolar. It's accessible from both perspectives. If I click that button, this LFO is now bipolar. You can see that this little horizontal line goes through the wave. Now when I press the same note, watch the little orange dot. So the total distance, the distance between the top and the bottom amount of modulation is going to be the same. It's just being shifted. Now when we were in unipolar mode, let's turn it back into unipolar. And here are all the positive values again. We could have made that negative by inverting the modulation depth. So at the moment, the modulation depth is positive, which means the modulation is positive. If we invert the modulation, now all the modulation values that the LFO is imparting to the filter cutoff, they're all negative. And that's why you control the polarity from within the mapping section itself. Where you define the depth is also where you're interested in defining the polarity of the modulation. Let's switch back to bipolar. In the main LFO section itself, we control the frequency. Everything that you've heard so far has been cycling at 1 Hz. Let's make it go faster. As with most settings in Halion, you can push it to the absolute extreme. So if you turn it all the way down to 0, it stops being an LFO anymore, and you can see that the line's flatlined. Generally speaking, you would want, you know, even a tiny amount of modulation. These really, really slow LFOs can be great on things like flanges where you want massively long, slow sweeping modulations over enormous periods of time. Double click, set it back to 1. To the left of the frequency, we have shape, and this is tied to the primary wave shape that we have in our selectable waveform dropdown. So at the moment we're dealing with the sine wave, but if we increase shape, we're going to perform some sort of deform on that wave, and it's dependent on what your primary wave type is. You're also going to see an output of it appear in this envelope window to the right. So as I start increasing shape, it basically introduces new harmonics into the wave, and you see a representation of it in the little viewer as well. Now you can hear the big pulse and then the smaller pulses underneath. Let's have a quick run through some of the other waveform types. So triangle at shape 0 is your classical triangle, and as we increase the shape, we basically deform it to turn it into trapezoids. You can see it flattening off. If we turn the shape, I might as well get this going as well while I'm talking. So we've got triangles with flat tops and bottoms, and at 100, we basically pull those shapes all the way up and we turned it into a square wave. Turn that back down again and jump to saw. Now you can have downsloping and upsloping sawtooths, but in Halion they do different things. So the downsloping sawtooth shapes into a triangle at 50%, 50 shape, and then eventually becomes an upsloping or ramp saw at 100. On the other hand, if you actually choose a ramp, you can see the wave shape is deforming to adjust the hypotenuse, so different angles being adjusted. It's unusual to have saws and ramps perform different behaviors, but very cool, because otherwise you're just effectively replicating the same functionality. Should be fairly easy to figure out what a pulse wave is going to do when we modulate this. This is going to be basically PWM, adjusting the width of the pulse. And so at 50, we're going to generate a square wave. Don't forget, this is a square wave LFO. So don't think about it in terms of PWM from an audio perspective, where you're changing the sound of the wave. You're changing how long the modulator is on or off for. Logarithmic waves and exponential waves. Logarithm is basically the inverse of an exponential wave. So you can hear these have a kind of more organic feel about them. Logarithms, that's basically the way the brain works, so we empathize with logarithms. Sample and hold is very cool. You want nice fast oscillating frequency, and at the moment I've got a 0 shape, which means all of the lines of the sample and hold generator are straight, that everything is angular. Sample and hold basically says do a thing for a period of time and then change your mind and do another completely random thing for a period of time. So the low frequency oscillator is going to be jumping all over the place. Let's adjust some of these values and get something a bit cool. There we go. Now as we adjust the shape, we're going to smooth this sample and hold generation out so that the lines aren't all angular. We just smoothed all of those jumps out, but it is still random. Now I've accidentally jumped straight to sample and hold 2 here, and I only noticed when I looked at the wave. You can tell that you're in a sample and hold 2 wave because it oscillates, it basically flips between positive and negative values. So they're still random, but there's some kind of pattern to the randomness, as opposed to sample and hold 1, which is genuinely absolutely random, and the previous value has nothing to do with the next value. Very nice. Let me jump back to sawtooth in order to describe how the phase works. At 0 degrees, you always start the sawtooth at exactly the top, this point here. As we move the knob forwards, you can see basically the wave moving backwards positionally or forwards in time. So the starting point of the wave is going to be further along than it otherwise would have been. And if we move all the way to 360 degrees, we've basically traveled the entire length of one wave. So this allows us to determine where each wave starts. Now, that's all very well and good, but at the moment, it's got nothing to do with the key triggers. This wave is oscillating in the background, and so you wouldn't be able to perceive the changes that I was making to this phase control. In order to lock the LFO to my key presses, I need to engage retrigger. And now every time I press the key, it sounds absolutely identical. As I move the phase control, I'm adjusting the position, the starting position of the LFO, and it's basically doing this thing to the filter cutoff. If I disengage retrigger, you're hearing something completely different. What you're hearing now is me jumping on the back of a moving wave like an escalator, and the escalator doesn't care when I press the key. I just basically get what I'm given. If I slow it right down and press lots of keys quickly, you can actually hear the wave being drawn in the background. We can override this phase control by engaging random mode. You can see the phase control knob gets disengaged. Now every key press is going to generate a different phase value. So if I engage retrigger, now I can't redraw that wave in the background like I used to be able to, because Halion's choosing a new place to start drawing its wave each time, as opposed to absolute consistency. At the moment, all of these retrigger values are a fixed frequency, basically a quarter of a hertz or once every 4 seconds. If I change the sync mode to tempo plus retrig, now this is slightly clunky terminology because this retrig has got nothing to do with this retrig. If I disengage retrig, all I've done is I've changed my frequency value to some sort of fractions of my host tempo. So that's operating in quarter notes at 111 BPM. In order for me to actually get the retrig functionality, I still need to turn the retrig button on. So I think this sync mode should just be called tempo, and it's confusing the situation by adding retrig onto the end. The situation gets even more confused when you go to tempo plus beat, because now the retrigger button is completely disabled, and Halion syncs to wherever the song position is. So I'm going to press a few keys. You'll hear the LFO sound exactly the same every time. If I move the song forwards to a new beat position, we still have absolute consistency, but we have consistency within the constraints of the underlying tempo. So if the song was playing, this is an empty project at the moment, but if the song is playing, let's slow it down enough, I can redraw my LFOs by pressing lots of very quick keys, but I'm doing it in the context of the song, so it's absolutely locked into the tempo of the song. Let's get back to simple sync mode. The next function along is called shared phase. Halion's LFOs are polyphonic, which means every time you press a key, it's generating its own brand new LFO completely dedicated to that key. So let's kind of get that concept locked in before we go to have a look at what shared phase does. Slow it down a little bit and I'll play. You can hear all of those different keys all triggering LFOs at different times. All of those cutoffs, all of those frequency filter cutoffs are doing different things according to when that particular key was pressed. If I engage shared phase, however, all the notes lock to a single primary oscillator, and if I have retrigger mode, I'm in complete control of when that oscillator fires. So now when I press exactly the same 6 notes, all 6 notes are using exactly the same LFO, and you can hear that filter sweep. So a friendlier label for this control would have been mono mode, because that's really what it does. It makes the LFO behave as if it's monophonic. Turn that back off again. On the right hand side of the LFO screen, we have this envelope. Now, at the moment, everything has been instantly on and on constantly. So this is one shot plus sustain mode. Every time I pressed a key in today's demonstrations, they've all been one shot plus sustain. Let's have a focus on the envelope window now and see what's going on. Watch this little yellow dot. Press the key. It's now stuck on the sustain node. So this point here is the sustain node. But we can draw complex shapes with this envelope. If I pick that node up and move it, what I've basically done now is introduced a slope over which you can see in the background the LFO is going to be introduced over a period of time up to 5 seconds. Let's press the same note. And I'll make the frequency slightly faster actually. And just accentuate this LFO to really hear it. So you can hear the LFO being introduced over this period of time. When we get to the sustain node, we will stick there and we'll stay there for as long as the key is pressed down. We can delay the onset of the LFO at all. So at the moment, we have a 0 milliseconds delay. I can either click in this box and drag up and down with my mouse. You can see that's having the effect. Or I can pick up the node and do it manually. Again, we have up to 5 seconds of delay before any LFO will be applied at all. The one-shot aspect of the description means that the LFO is going to describe its entire shape. It's going to do this thing when you press the note. For as long as you've pressed the note, it's basically going to travel through its journey. In hold mode, we don't have a sustain node. Now the LFO is going to be of fixed duration. So it's going to do exactly this, and it doesn't care how long you hold the note down for. It's still going to do exactly this. So it's going to carry on oscillating until we get to this point, and then it basically just shuts off. We can also introduce a fade out, which is basically like a release cycle, but it's got nothing to do with letting the key go. This shape is going to get drawn regardless of how long you hold the key down for. So here's the 5 seconds that it's going through its maximum level, and now it's going to start fading out. The LFO fades out while I've got the key held down. Now I've still got the key held down and the LFO is done. Sustain plus fade out is very difficult to demonstrate in our current setup because we have no release tone. There's no release phase on this envelope. So I'm going to be holding the key down for 5 seconds, but at this point we enter our sustain phase. Now when I let this key go, it is going to take a period of time to fade out, but of course the note itself has disappeared so you don't hear it. But trust me, if you let go and there was a release cycle on this envelope, you would hear the LFO operate in the background. Now, if I hadn't already made an 18-minute video about LXFO, I would start describing that now, but instead I'm going to have a look at that link, basically going to describe this really interesting cross low frequency oscillator. It's much more than just tying two LFOs together. You've got this bizarre thing where you can actually modulate the rate of the LFO over a period of time. Absolutely crazy. Check out the link. Having said that, that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.